you can introduce Chris, and we can let Chris
Hammersmark, hydrogeologist, longtime consultant to the Water Forum. Many of you are probably familiar with his work. Maybe all of you are familiar with his work. Among other things, he's been part of our salmon habitat design team, the so-called gravel team. And his firm is a relatively small firm that does what I think is pretty cutting edge stuff. I tapped him to give this presentation because I do think that he is one of the best science integrators that I've ever met, and that I thought he would be the best, just a really good person to give a broad range description of what's happening with the fishery from a physical, biological, chemical, climate standpoint. So with that, Chris Hammersmark. Oh, I'm sorry.
Tom.
I meant to say Dr. Chris Hammersmark, PE.
Thanks, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, okay, great. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. Again, Tom just said this, but full disclosure, I'm not a fish biologist. I'm trained as an engineer and a hydrologist. That being said, 95% of my professional career has been spent thinking about fisheries issues, whether they be habitat enhancement efforts or water temperature mod support fisheries enhancement. So I am familiar with the topics, but if your questions delve particularly deep, I may have to suggest we refer them to a fish biologist. With that, I'll get started. Second confession is I have many slides, so I may talk fast. I'm going to try not to, but there were dozens and dozens of questions posed to me, and so I've done my best to answer all of them. These are what I'm going to cover today. I'm not going to tell you right, but you will see this slide several times sort of dividing between topics, and so that is a good point to ask a clarifying question if you have any. I won't be monitoring the chat window, but Tanya will be and helping me with any questions that I need to respond to immediately as opposed to at the end of the presentation. With that being said, I'm going to dive right into the status of Chinook salmon. So Chinook salmon, the only species of salmon that we have in the Central Valley is a federally listed species of special concern. Yes, not listed. Pardon that misstep. The top anthropogenic threats to Chinook salmon Central Valley wide are hatcheries, the degradation of estuaries, in this case the Bay Delta, as well as agriculture in the variety of ways that it cuts through either redirection of water, different pathways that the water travels, water quality, conversion of floodplains and other areas to agriculture. On the right, I present a graph put together by Cal Trout in their State of the Salmon report, which is a great report I suggest you all take a look at. And it shows both the current range of Central Valley fall run Chinook salmon, as well as the historical range. And while I see what we can see here, and I guess I have one question for Tanya or others. Can you see my mouse? Yes, okay, yes. Fantastic.
Yep.
So what we see here is that the range in the American River watershed is about a third of what it historically would have been. And so now the limit of anadromy is at Nimbus Dam in Rancho Cordova, and Chinook would have occupied up to about, say, Auburn previously. There's been about the current habitat is about a third the size of what was once available, at least in the American River. I was asked to talk about what targets we have for recovery, and the primary target that we talk about is what's known as the doubling goal. It was established by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with their anadromous fish restoration program, and what it did is it looked at natural production historically for a given period, and that period was 1967 to 1991. It's shown on this chart here. And it took the average of the natural production of fall run Chinook salmon. And then realizing that that population was already depressed, they set their target as essentially double that. That's where we get the doubling goal. And so the average value was just shy of 81,000. And so the natural production target for the lower American River is 160,000. I will note that in the period that I show here from 1992 to 2015, we only had just over 98,000. So we're falling well short of the doubling goal. While things had improved slightly from the period before, we're falling well short. There's an important clarifying point I'd like to make at this time, and that's the difference between natural production and escapement. So natural production are the number of adults that are out in the ocean available and could come back. However, they don't all come back, and the primary reason for that is harvest from the commercial fishery. There's certainly a recreational fishery component as well, but the fish that actually make it back to the river, that is termed escapement, and that is less than the natural production value. And so while the natural production target is 160,000 adults, the escapement target is closer to 82,000 adults. And so that's just an important thing to keep in mind when people talk about the doubling goal. We're not talking about 160,000 fish coming back to the American River. I've updated the last part with the more recent data. The last one ended in about 2015, and I just wanted to show what's been happening in more recent years. And what we can see is that the population levels are certainly variable going through boom and bust cycles. However, many folks note that we seem to be doing fairly well in the early 2000s, only for that to be followed by a pretty significant crash. The next component that I'm pointing out on this slide is the comparison of the number of fish that return to the hatchery and are spawned as opposed to those in the river. And as we can see, the hatchery component is typically a smaller fraction of the total population. In dry years, it comes, or in low return years, it comes to about a 50-50 ratio. But in years where there are higher returns, we see significantly more fish spawning in the river than return to the hatchery and are spawned there. Well, what was the cause of this crash, you asked? It was a very good question, and I've enjoyed learning about it. The folks at NIMPS wrote a technical memorandum related to exactly this: what caused the Sacramento River fall Chinook stock collapse. The primary cause that they determined was ocean conditions for the 2004 and 2005 broods. And so weak upwelling, so meaning the northwest winds hadn't started to blow yet, and we didn't have nutrient-rich water pushing up from deeper depths in the ocean, combined with warm surface temperatures and low density of prey items, basically made it a food desert when the juvenile fish were entering the ocean. And the reason they've been able to identify it, the ocean conditions, is that freshwater conditions were not unusual. I won't say that they were great, but they weren't significantly worse than years prior. And the freshwater abundance of the juvenile fish was at normal levels. And so it really seems that as fish enter the ocean, that's the weak link in the chain. It isn't entirely ocean conditions. There are several additional factors that were listed, hatcheries being a very significant one. You'll learn more about hatchery in a couple of moments, but they were created to counteract 150 years of habitat degradation, such that our Central Valley salmon are now dominated by 4 large hatcheries rather than numerous diverse wild populations. And as a result, the naturally spawning salmon are genetically homogeneous with synchronous population dynamics. And so they aren't very diverse, and the time when they return from the ocean is very compressed, as opposed to being spread across a wider range of time that will allow for, would provide resilience for dealing with different environmental conditions. And the survival of hatchery fish is highly correlated and highly variable. So they're either going to do well and we're going to have booms in the population, or they're not going to do well and we're going to have busts. And so we're going to see this sort of fluctuating boom bust cycle going forward. There was also some cause due to the cessation of net pen acclimatization in the estuary for 2006, as well as poor fishery management. And one of the years, there was an erroneous preseason ocean abundance estimate that was actually 300% of the actual value. And so the commercial fishery should have been limited more than it was. I'll take a breath and ask if there are any clarifying questions for that portion.
Yeah, I have a question. Chris,
Okay.
This is Greg Zlotnick. I just find it interesting, if you go back to their slide, that basically, at least from their report, and I'd be curious if you have other information you'd like to share, group, none of that has to do with water management in terms of the primary causes of the crash. It's ocean management, it's ocean conditions, hatcheries. So do you have any idea in terms of what was happening with water management at that time and whether that contributed or not, or if you want to make a generic comment about that as it relates to these issues?
I would say that water management is certainly on the list of factors that have been considered, and I would say that water management, at least in the way of the creation of dams and that limit on habitat, certainly played a role. As far as water releases, I can't speak with any authority as to how it was different and how it may have impacted, but they did not. The scientists at National Marine Fisheries Service did not identify that as a primary cause.
And just one more thing, and Tom, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in this report, I think it's this report, there's a matrix of, priority causes or whatever, or impacts that might be of interest, because it lists some of the things that Chris talked about, but they're like way down the list about, other things that can be done. And I don't know if that's something that might be of value to people to see. I don't know if you remember that, Tom, or not. Thank you.
All right, Rob Burness, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the recovery goals. Were they for the entire Sacramento River watershed, or were they weren't for just the American River? Were they?
Doubling goals have been established for every tributary, including the Cosumnes. What I'm reporting here is just the Lower American River doubling goal of 160,000.
Okay, so it was just low.
Produced.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Chris, this is Ryan Becerra.
Okay.
Just a quick question. How does the Americans' performance relative to the doubling goal look relative to the rest of the Sacramento Valley streams?
I'd have to look at the results to give you an exact answer. I would say that the American is fairly similar to most of the large rivers, being, say, American, Feather, Upper Sac. They're all battling with the same group of issues, with the large one being hatchery management, which I'll talk about in a couple moments. So I don't think we're faring better or worse, but I could certainly look into that and provide a summary on sort of the overall Sacramento run status.
Thanks. Chris, I'm going to encourage you to push ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Status of steelhead. These are two charts showing essentially the same thing, but it's showing the historical amount of habitat as compared to what is now available based on the construction of rim dams. As compared to Chinook, we can see that the amount of habitat for steelhead in the Central Valley, and particularly on the American River, is much contracted from what it once was this figure on the left, we can see that they would have been well up into the foothills and higher elevations, and now they're basically confined to the lower 23 miles of the American River on the baking hot Central Valley floor. Just to compare the differences between Chinook and Steelhead, Chinook on the left, Steelhead on the right, we can see how the historical range extended much farther up into the Sierra, and Steelhead were federally listed as threatened in 1998. How are they doing in the American? I'm plotting a number of charts that were produced by Kramer Fish Sciences and recently presented at the ARG meeting. The first panel in the bottom left here shows the number of observed reds. So these are the reds that were observed by folks doing red surveys out in the river. And we can see that aside from 1 year, we've observed 200 or less reds, and certainly in the last 10 years, again, aside from 2013, it was well less than 100 reds. From these red surveys and angler surveys, they're able to produce a spawning steelhead population estimate. That's what's shown on the right side here. And from this, although there's lots of additional information, you can see that in recent years, the estimate for the spawning population is somewhere between 100 and 200 fish. So the population is significantly depressed and much smaller than it would have been historically. I'm sorry, I'm not able to provide the earlier data on this. One last point to show is that the steelhead are utilizing a larger portion of the river than Chinook. While Chinook are concentrated in, say, the upper third of the river and even the upper fifth, steelhead are also concentrated there, but we see reds as far down as Watt Avenue and even down to Paradise Beach at River Mile 5.5 or so. So they're spawning throughout the river as opposed to Chinook, who are more concentrated in the upper portions. And I swap in a new slide here on the bottom right to show the population estimate as far as in river as composed to the number of steelhead that return to the hatchery. And so we can see that a large number of fish return to the hatchery and are spawned. It's the flip of Chinook, where in this case, the hatchery returns are far larger than what we see in the river. Just gonna keep going. So now I'm gonna talk a little bit about hatcheries. This is admittedly okay, yep.
I'm sorry, you can go back. This is Greg. I'm curious why go back one more, why the spike in 2013 in terms of the observed reds, and maybe one more slide, didn't seem to equate in the other years, or is that a same year fish? So it does show a relationship.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but different than Chinook. Chinook, as we have evolved them, have a central tendency of coming back after 3 years. They can come back anywhere from 1 to 7 years, but the way we have selected for fish, they're coming back pretty much after 3 years, with some differences. Steelhead are far more variable than that, and so you don't see sort of an immediate sort of cyclical response. And I'm not sure if I actually answered your question there or not.
You did, thank you. That's helpful.
I'll apologize for this grainy image, but it is nice in that it shows the freshwater and saltwater components of the salmon life cycle. And specifically, we'll be focusing on the freshwater part, which is what hatcheries have replaced what normally would happen in the natural environment. And so as a fish returns to the lower American, finds its way to the hatchery ladder and climbs up this series of step pools with observers in awe, it then enters the hatchery. It is euthanized and spawned, either a male or a female extracting the eggs or a male extracting the milk. The eggs and semen are then mixed to produce fertilized eggs. These are very much test tube babies. You should be thinking this is the equivalent of IVF. And then they are kept at as cool of temperatures as is possible as they develop. And then once they are large enough to be released into a larger aquatic environment. They are raised in what's known as raceways. These are very simple canals that are populated with large numbers of fish. They are very, very simple as far as complexity goes. They're all the same depth. They have pretty much the same velocity conditions. There is no predation. We can see that there is a net across the top of these at the top to keep birds out of the way. And they are fed either by hopper driving along or by eager future conservationists throwing fish food onto the surface, where they go absolutely nuts. You can see this feeding frenzy happening here. And the main reason I point this out is that we are training the fish sort of the wrong ways to survive in the natural environment. One, they're not afraid of predators. Two, they don't know how to take advantage of cover or structure. Three, they're looking to the surface for their food, which is not how you survive as a juvenile fish. You would be typically feeding off of prey items in drift, meaning they're in the water column or bouncing along near the bottom. And so right out of the gate, we've already trained them with poor skills to survive in a natural environment. Before they are released into the wild, a subset of the Chinook salmon are marked. They are a coded wire tag, which is really just a tiny piece of wire with a code on it, is implanted in near their nose. And then there is a physical marking done. The adipose fin, which is also sometimes called the second dorsal fin, is removed. And this allows anglers to identify whether it's a hatchery fish or not. Again, only 25% of the Chinook are marked in this way, whereas 100% of steelhead are marked. And the reason that 100% of steelhead are marked is you're not allowed to take wild fish if you're an angler. And so if you catch a fish that has an adipose fin, you need to release it. They are then trucked to some location where they are released. Here's just an image showing a truck full of fish and them being spit out into the river at some location. On the right is an image from about 2011 with the yellow dots showing the various release points. And there are different strategies that are used. The example on the bottom left here is if all of the fish were released in basin, meaning in the river where the hatchery is located and where the parents had returned to. 1998 is an example of where in river and net pen estuary releases occurred, and we can see the density of fish and how it's widely spread out. And then here is 2015, a drought year where no in-river releases were conducted. They were all trucked to the bay and put into net pens where they acclimate to the saltwater conditions, or at least at that point brackish water conditions, before heading out to the ocean. And the main reason we truck is because these fish have very, very low levels of survival. They weren't raised in the river. They don't know how to operate in the river, and they're highly susceptible to mortality from a number of functions, but predation being a very high component of it. And so the reason we're trucking fish is because too many of them would die if we just released them in the river. What do we know about the fish that we've tagged? There's a series of reports that are available. There are 4 of them now. I'm showing the cover page for the most recent one, which was prepared in 2018, and it references recovered coded wire tags in 2013. The information can tell us a lot about what the fish are doing. And the slide on the right, I'm showing the 2013 results. The gray areas are, or the gray area of the pie charts show what proportion of the fish came back and went to the hatchery, as opposed to what proportion of these coded or these tagged fish spawned in the wild. And what we can see is that on average, about 2/3 of the hatchery fish go back to the hatchery, and at least in the American, and 1/3, and I'm showing this here, 1/3 tried to spawn in the river. You can see that we have various fractions in different rivers, and the size of the pie chart refers to the number of fish that came back. On the bottom left here, I'm showing results from each of the 4 years with the average shown in the last chart. While it is variable, again, we see about 1/3 in river, 2/3 in hatchery. Now, if we look at the same information with regards to what's happening in the river, we see that on average, 80% or more of the fish, the wild fish, or that's not true, not wild, the natural fish, meaning they were born in the river, returned to the hatchery, and a small fraction of them returned to spawn in the river. And I should just make a clarifying point here. To be a natural fish, all you have to do is be born in the river, but you could be born of 2 hatchery adults. And so at best, you're 1 generation away from being a hatchery fish. We shouldn't be thinking about these as wild fish with distinctly different genetics. Well, what do we know as far as straying?
Hey, Chris Ryan has a quick question for you. Ryan?
Yeah, could you go back to the next slide? So actually, I was asking about, wanted to ask about steelhead numbers. So steelhead and rainbow trout, as I understand it, are essentially the same fish genetically. So how do you go about counting any sort of returns, or is it even possible to do that with steelhead? As to what's steelhead, what's rainbow trout?
Yes, steelhead and rainbow trout are genetically the same species and can either choose to go to the ocean or not. There are genetic strains that have been shown to have a higher likelihood of limiting or of demonstrating anadromous characteristics, at least going to the ocean. But a lot of our water management has allowed fish to stay in the river environment longer because of cool releases all through the summer, whereas under natural conditions, as temperatures warmed up, the fish would have been cued to leave the river. And so they can go back and forth, either be resident or anadromous. As far as how we count them, the hatchery fish are tagged, and then there are red surveys and angler surveys that allow us to understand what number of fish are coming back.
Thanks.
So what do we know? And this is, I'm primarily talking about straying in this image. These pie charts show us the origin of the fish that came back into the hatchery. And so in 2003, the 86% of the population came back to the hatchery, and of that 86%, roughly 3/4 were American River fish by origin. Little less than half were in-basin fish. Little more than 1/4 were Nimbus fish that were released from net pens out in the estuary. And then the remaining 1/4 or so is comprised of fish from other systems. The biggest chunk being McCallamy River hatchery fish, then followed by Coleman hatchery fish and Feather River fish. And so we're seeing a lot of straying, and this is a particularly challenging topic because fish had evolved for characteristics that best suited the river they were living in. And now we've sort of blended all of the genetics into one common domesticated salmon is really where we're at today. And so this is just, again, giving us an example of where the fish that are coming back are coming from, and they're not all American River fish. Too many words here, and I apologize. I'm not going to read the first block. I'll talk for a moment on the second block and then really emphasize on this last block. So hatchery management is a very contentious topic in the Central Valley, beyond the Central Valley, quite honestly. And they commissioned the California Hatchery Review Project, which is a group of academics and resource scientists that looked at hatcheries and what needed to be done to improve their outcome. They developed a number of standards and guidelines for these various topics. I'm not going to read them to you. What do they expect as the outcomes from implementing these guidelines? The biggest one is the reduction in the domestication of hatchery fish. We've selected for a fish that does well in raceways and doesn't particularly do well in rivers or in the ocean for that matter. They expect the reduction in the negative impacts of hatchery fish on natural populations, and they believe that if these are implemented, we have improved prospects for the long-term successful coexistence of hatchery and natural fish. To distill it down a little bit, improving hatchery operations really is going to come down to two things, and that's physical segregation. So trying to separate hatchery fish from natural fish to reduce competition and reduce mortality. And then there's a genetic segregation where there is a desire to try to keep wild genetics as pure as possible and not diluted by the anthropogenic evolution of fish and hatcheries. And I include the cows here on the right because that's very much where we are. We've breeded a fish that doesn't do well in the natural environment, and that is really affecting wild populations where they're still present. Couple fun facts. You know that a wild salmon produces 8 times more grandchildren than a hatchery salmon. And so we really need to protect these wild natural genetics because they are absolutely much more fit. They do better in the river environment. They succumb less to mortality. They're more likely to come back. And did you know that only 1 out of 1,000 hatchery produced salmon returned in 2009? So we're talking about a 0.1% return rate. And again, a big part of this is these fish just aren't adapted to the natural environment after being raised in a test tube and in a raceway.
Hey, Chris Bennett here with a quick question. Quick question on that 1 in 1,000. What would be the comparable figure for a natural salmon? How many would return?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I wish I had the answer. I can look into it and get back to you, but I don't have it. But it's much better than that. Although it's nowhere near 1-to-1 by any means. But it's not
Sure.
1 in 1,000.
Thanks.
Any other questions before I go on?
Not seeing anything in the chat or any raised hands.
Okay.
Okay.
I was asked to talk about rearing habitat, or I was asked to talk about salmonid habitat in general. And we divided into 2 bins: rearing habitat, which is what you use if you're a baby, think about a playground, and then spawning habitat, where fish are reproducing when they're adults just before they die. As far as rearing habitat, I think about it more as like nook and cranny habitat. It's a function of depth, velocity, cover, or structure. And then really importantly, food. You need to have food if it's going to be rearing habitat. These fish are needing to get bigger. On the bottom, I show curves of sort of the range of depths that are considered ideal for rearing. So 1/2 foot to maybe about 4 feet on depth, so not too deep. And then velocity, it's certainly the lower velocities because these are small fish and they don't want to spend a lot of their energy just holding. They're trying to put on pounds so that they're larger as they head out to the ocean. We're able to estimate the amount of rearing habitat through the application of a hydraulic model. And so we can take, for any given flow, we can take the depths that are simulated with the model, the velocities that are simulated with the model, and then include that with a map of cover and or substrate. Substrate would be for spawning. And we're able to predict the habitat suitability. So this is an example of the Arden Maze area just below the bike bridge at Riverbend Park. And this is the habitat suitability at 10,000 CFS. The red areas are suitable, but very marginally suitable. They're on the edges of the depth or velocity range. Whereas the blue areas are optimal, they're ideal. They're following exactly where we would expect the fish to like them. And so while we can see there's vast areas of marginal habitat and then smaller areas of high quality habitat, we can take this and then sum it up to get an understanding of the available habitat throughout the river. And I guess before I go there, this is just a quick poor man's animation to sort of show you how habitat availability, both quantity and quality, changes as flows increase. So here's 500 CFS up in the top. I show you what flow rate we're at, and we see that there's actually a lot of really poor quality habitat. The depth is right, the velocity is right, but there's no cover, there's no structure, there would be very limited food. As flows increase, we see that that actually reduces. And then at some point, now we're at 5,500, we're starting to interact with the edge where flows are getting into vegetation, and we start to see little bits of these other colors where habitat is starting to improve. Flows increase, the main channel pretty much washes out completely, and we start seeing slightly larger areas of better quality rearing habitat. But keep in mind now, this is 15,000 CFS, and this next one is 30,000 CFS. And so it's not until flows get really high that we observe better quality rearing habitat. We can take our information for the whole river. I was just showing you a reach there, and we can sum it up to understand what the weighted usable area of habitat is across a range of flows. And one point to make here is that, yes, for rearing habitat, more flow is better. It provides more habitat. However, the incremental increase per volume of release is relatively small. So for example, to go from 100 acres to 120 acres, it's an increase of about 2,500 CFS. And that's not just for one day. That would need to be for a sustained period that the fish could take advantage of it. And so it's fairly challenging to get the amount of habitat we need just by releasing more water. How much habitat do we think we need? The folks at Kramer Fish Sciences.
Sorry, Chris, I gotta jump in really quickly and just brag on the Water Forum team. The series of slides that Chris just showed you are pretty cutting edge stuff. And I've been in meetings when Hammer and our team have showed these slides to people from other tributaries, and they've just been blown away. They wish they had the tools to do the things that Hammer just showed us.
Sounds good. The folks at Kramer Fish Sciences have estimated the amount of habitat we think we need. Being the pointy-headed scientists that they are, they reported in river kilometer and hectare, but don't worry, I've translated it for you in a moment. What they did is they took the doubling goal target, they seeded their model, and then that model grows fish and releases them into the river, and then it tells us how much habitat we need to support that size population. I'm going to draw your attention to the green lines, which are their assumption for medium habitat quality, which is a good assumption. And then the dot or the solid show whether it's a dry year type or a wet year type, and that really relates to how fast the fish are moving downstream. I've now taken those two same curves, but converted them into acres and river miles. So here is the confluence of the Sacramento River. Here is Nimbus Dam on the right side. These are the habitat needs to support the doubling population. And then this is the amount of habitat that we have at different flow rates. And so, for example, in this center bin here, which is pretty much Riverbend Park, if you think about it, the model estimates that we need about 85 acres in a roughly 2.3 mile reach. And we have much, much, much less than that. Even at 30,000 CFS, we have less than half the habitat we need. And if you come down to a flow that would be more typical in the spring, say 3,500, we're at maybe an eighth or less of the amount of habitat that we would need to support the population. I'm going to move on to spawning now. So now when Chinook salmon come back and prepare what's known as a redd or a nest, they use their tail to dig a hole in the gravel. The gravel has to be small enough that they can actually move it, but big enough such that there are interstitial pockets where their eggs can be deposited. The female will dig a red. It will choose an area based off of its depth and velocity. These are the characteristics that they select for in the American River. So, you know, roughly 1 to 3 feet deep and 1 to 3 feet per second in velocity is sort of a good rule of thumb. And then on top of that, what I can't predict with a model is it also has to have high quality intergravital gravel flow, which keeps the water in the red pocket high quality with enough dissolved oxygen to be able to flush away the metabolic waste. If we don't have any flow through the gravel, the eggs would die before they're able to emerge. So the female would dig a red, the male would come and fertilize as she's releasing her eggs, and then the female would use her tail to then bury the eggs in the red. The eggs will spend 2 to 3 months in the gravel before they emerge as emergent fry, and then they kind of move into that rearing period that I just talked about a moment ago. How much spawning habitat do we have? Unlike rearing, we have not been able to do a full census of the available rearing habitat in the American River. Our estimates are based off of select reaches where a lot of spawning has occurred and understanding how they function across a range of flows. And so using depth, velocity, and substrate size, we're able to estimate how much habitat is available in each of these regions that are shown on this figure. And they're plotted here individually, as well as their total in this black curve. And what we find is that the optimum flow for maximizing the amount of rearing habitat on the American River is about 1900 CFS, so just shy of 2000 CFS. What's significantly different than rearing is that as flows increase, the amount of available spawning habitat actually reduces, because the areas that have the appropriate substrate basically get washed out. They get too deep or too fast for Chinook to be able to build their reds. For steelhead, it's very similar. They have similar preferences for depth and velocity, but they are slightly different. And because of those differences, we see that the optimum for habitat of steelhead occurs more at about 1600 CFS. I'm not able to tell you how much habitat we have, but I can with confidence say we don't have enough spawning habitat to be able to support the doubling goal. I think we are closer on spawning habitat than we are on rearing, but that's mostly because we've spent the last 10 years building habitat projects every year that directly benefit both spawning and rearing Chinook. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. I'll take a quick break for questions. All right, moving on. Water temperature gets debated an awful lot, and honestly, different biologists have different opinions. There are a number of studies, and folks often latch on to different numbers. And so these by far are not absolutely definitive values, but I think they are instructive. Salmonids are ectotherms. They're cold water beings. They don't like it hot, like say a bass or a sunfish would like it. What I'm presenting here are the upper tolerable water temperatures for fall run Chinook and steelhead. Can they live above these temperatures for short periods? Yes. Will they thrive at temperatures above this? Absolutely not. When you kind of tick above the upper tolerable, now the increased temperature and the bioenergetic demands that drives mean that the fish's condition is actually decreasing with time as opposed to increasing. And so can they hang on for some period? Yes. Are they thriving? Absolutely not. Are these the optimal temperatures? Absolutely not. Fish would do better, meaning they would grow faster and be healthier if if temperatures are lower than this. These are sort of the thresholds for where the scale tips and they start doing less well, basically having negative growth as opposed to positive growth. There's also another number of curves or values that would be incipient lethal, where a fish immediately dies. That's not what I'm showing here. These are temperatures that up to here, they should be able to tolerate it. Above this, their condition will diminish through time, ultimately leading in death. For Chinook salmon, we can see that the coldest upper tolerable values are about 58 degrees, whereas for immigration, staging, and outmigration, the upper tolerable values are 65 degrees. For steelhead, we see similar values. I will note that commonly used values for Chinook spawning are 56 degrees as more of an upper limit, and for juvenile rearing of steelhead would be 65. And the reason I point those out is because of this chart here to sort of show you, compared to temperature indices where we think fish would do well, the American is already very challenged. I apologize that these are fairly old, but this is the slide I had prepared. We can see that through the summer, the period of time that's greater than 65 degrees at Watt Avenue is very substantial through the summer months when juvenile steelhead would be rearing in the lower American. And then in the fall months when the fall runner come back and wanting to spawn, starting in October, we can see that we're almost always above 56 degrees. They are certainly challenged by the thermal regime at present. Without climate change, we're already in a very difficult spot. I borrowed one of the slides from the PCWA slides from last week, just to sort of bring this point home that, so September water temperatures, so this would be a period when juvenile steelhead would be rearing, and they would prefer it to be 65 degrees or less. About half the time, we have conditions that they would prefer now. However, looking to the future, and as the folks from PCWA told us, we could expect it to increase by almost 7 degrees for the median value. And the amount of time that's less than 65 will be dramatically reduced from 50% to perhaps 20 or even less. So looking into the future, we certainly have temperature challenges ahead that we'll need to tackle. I'll take a break and answer any questions on temperature.
Not seeing anything in the queue or in the chat again.
Okay, I was asked to provide an update on the temperature control device at Folsom. Here's an image taken during drought conditions that shows these are the radial gates of the spillway, as well as the TCDs, as they're called, temperature control devices. And each penstock has its own individual TCD that can be operated independently. And what they are is a series of shutters or metal sheets that are inserted into tracks and lowered down such that water can be withdrawn from a specified elevation. Here's a schematic showing the same thing. We have a cross section of the dam showing the power penstock elevation, and then the series of shutters. And while they were initially built as 9 separate shutters, in the past they were ganged, or they were grouped together into a batch of 3, a batch of 2, and then a batch of 4. And this is how we currently can operate the reservoir. So we can either put all of the shutters in and withdraw from about 401 feet. We can take the top shutter out and pull from about 40 feet down. We can take the next set of shutters out and pull from 336 feet, or we can take the last shutter out and then we're basically pulling from the penstock elevation. And so this allows us to choose what temperature water we're releasing. Now, that coarse nature of only having 3 elevations does limit our ability to manage the available cold water to the best way possible. And so here's an example from 2007. They were trying to achieve a 67-degree temperature target at Watt Avenue, which is the green line. Blue is what's coming out of Folsom, red's what's coming out of Nimbus, green is what's passing Watt Avenue. And as we can see in early July here, the temperature was approaching the temperature target, and they did a shutter pull. They jumped down 50 feet in the reservoir, and they all of a sudden are releasing much colder water. Now, I won't say that that water is wasted, but I will say that it's not being used in the most efficient way possible. And for example, if temperature could have been maintained in the mid 60s, we could have utilized some of that cold water to either keep these temperatures below 67 degrees, or perhaps even kept it until the fall and been able to reduce the temperatures as the fall run are beginning to spawn. And so this is a sort of clunky and less precise way of managing temperatures, and it leads to less than optimal utilization of our extremely limited cold water pool resource. Next, the current TCD is as leaky as a sieve, to be a little too colloquial. There are lots of gaps around the edges of the structure where water is pulled in, and then the shutters don't often seat well against each other, leaving big gaps that allow cold water to enter the structure. And so we're not really able to target the elevation or the water temperature that we like. And just to sort of present that in a data format, the blue is what is actually coming out of Folsom Dam, and the orange is the temperature that should be coming out if the water were coming from the top of the shutter. And from this and other analyses, we estimate that leakage is anywhere from 15 to 45% of the total flow. That depends on the stage in the reservoir and how many shutters are in place. But leakage is a really big deal and has the potential for significant temperature improvements if it's addressed. As we participated in the Folsom Value Planning effort in 2014, the Army Corps shared their 35% designs with us. We were quite pleased and flabbergasted at the same time when they walked in and they plopped these plans on the table. What I'm reporting now is based off of this information that was provided in 2014, based off of 2012, but I can say that the design is currently being advanced by HDR. Tom and I talked with Jeff Weaver about it just a few weeks ago. The proposed design will automate the shutters, which will make it much easier to make adjustments. Right now, they have to use a big gantry crane. Let me see. They have to, went too far. They have to use this big crane to lift these shutters out, and it takes a lot of effort, and it needs to be scheduled. And so now they have to say at least 4 days ahead of time, hey, I'd like you to pull a shutter, which makes it sort of challenging to act on the fly. So it will automate the shutters, meaning with the push of a button, they can be set to a different level. It'll also provide more flexibility as to what elevation the water is pulled from, and it should address leakage, although probably not completely. We've also been told that it will include the ability to add a elephant's trunk, which would allow access to water lower down in the reservoir, although it's unclear whether that will be included at this time or whether it will just be accommodated for a potential addition in the future. Again, this is what the current TCD sort of looks like, thanks to Tom Goring and his incredible 3D modeling skills. This is the top view of any one of those, and we can see that there's essentially 5 bays of shutters that create one of the TCDs. And now if I look at just one of those bays, this is the design as they have suggested it. So each one of those bays would have 5 gates that would be able to be raised or lowered by a cable and a hoist at the top. And then they can be lowered or raised and able to pull water essentially infinitely or infinitely variable as far as what elevation. And so this would really allow us to tune in exactly what water temperature we want to withdraw. And again, I won't say waste, but not use cold water in a less than opportunistic way. Well, what do we think we can gain from this? These are some earlier results where I just did some temperature modeling of 30% leakage versus no leakage. And each year is grouped into sort of 3 different periods: the early summer, the summer, and then the fall. And what we can see is that by reducing leakage, we absolutely would increase temperatures in the early season, but that's okay because this period we're typically well below the temperature requirements for fish, and so that would be just fine. But you also see big blocks of potential temperature reduction on the order of 1 to 2 degrees through the summer months, and then again in the fall months. And this alone would just be based off of not leaking cold water early in the season. And these increases would be very, very significant for steelhead and Chinook salmon. I'll take a break. Any questions on that?
Not seeing anything yet.
Okay. This one's real quick. I was asked to provide an update on the Nimbus Hatchery fish ladder. I think all of us have heard about this for quite some time, over 10 years. At a recent ARG, they actually came and gave a presentation, and so I'm stealing the slide from there. The current hatchery access, basically they put in, there is an existing barrier weir where they install pickets that are supposed to prevent fish from getting upstream of it. The pickets actually don't work very well, and every year thousands of fish make it upstream of the pickets, but the goal is to route fish into the hatchery, where they then go up the ladder that I showed you earlier and enter the facility. That current ladder will be converted into an ADA access ramp, allowing folks in wheelchairs down to the edge of the river. And this ladder will be replaced with a much longer flume fishway with also a ladder that will then basically pull fish from just below Nimbus Dam. And the benefit here is that fish will access this area and then be able to enter the hatchery. There will be less challenges with flow fluctuation, and ultimately it won't require the operation of this barrier weir. The project, I believe, if I remember correctly, is actually getting started later this year, at least the fishway aspect of it, and should be completed next year. Then they plan to operate it for a few years to make sure that it's working as intended before removing the barrier weir. But ultimately, in about 5 years, they also plan to remove this barrier weir. So it's been a long time coming, but it sounds like it's actually in progress now.
Chris, question for you from Ron Stork. Ron?
How does the fishway get water?
There would be water that goes to the facility and then is added in, and there are smaller amounts put at the top, and then as you get lower down the bottom, here we see the auxiliary attraction pipe flows. They add more water to really create a signal for the fish that, hey, I want to swim up that. We sort of fool them into thinking it's a tributary where they're going to go and have happy salmon sex.
So
Sorry.
So it's pumped. It's placed in the fishway at 2 places, 3 places.
3 places at the top, and then there are 2 additional auxiliary water locations.
And in both cases, they're pumped.
Yes.
And they're pumped from.
Pumped. I mean, it may be gravity driven. I can't speak with authority to that. I mean, it seems like we would have the head, but I don't know whether it's pumped or just gravity driven.
And it would seem to me that at least part of that fishway would be exposed to 115,000 or 160,000 CFS releases from Nimbus. How do they expect at least parts of that fishway to weather that?
That's a good question. I'm sure they have looked into that. The current ladder also is exposed to those types of flows, but perhaps in a more protected way, being kind of tucked behind the abutment a little bit. But that is a real concern. I can't tell you absolutely they've looked into it, but I'm confident that they have.
It's kind of a civil engineering question. It's unfair to ask you, but
Remember, I'm an engineer, not a hydrobiologist. Oh, wait. Just kidding.
There you go. So anyhow, I remain curious.
I've captured it.
I'm happy to look into it.
Yeah, I've got it down as a question. Chris,
Okay,
just a quick time check. It's 10 after. So
okay.
your section
I'm wrapping
can run
up.
till. Excellent. Perfect. Thanks.
What is the water forum doing to help? A lot. And this isn't an all-inclusive list, but I was running out of steam, I will admit, with my 64 slides. The habitat enhancement efforts have been invaluable as far as producing habitat. I'll talk more about that. Obviously, the flow management standard, both the 2006 and 2017, have established habitat-based minimum release requirements and included the iterative temperature management approach. As you all know, there are many, many other elements. These two are particularly significant for the salmonids. As a constant presence in the ARG, the Water Forum and its consultants are continually asked to provide input to aid in real-time operations of the river. As part of these technical support roles, we developed the ICPMM model for use by reclamation and have added several updates as requested, always being very responsive to their needs. We conduct temperature monitoring on a number of scales with, at one point, a network of 14 temperature sensors out in the river that aid us in improving both temperature management as well as increasing the ability of our models to accurately predict conditions. We do a lot of temperature modeling. We produce red dewatering estimates when reclamation says, oh, the flow's at 2,000 CFS and we want to drop it to 1,500 or even 1,200. We provide an estimate of how many reds would be dewatered by that flow reduction. We've used our models to identify stranding areas, which aids rescue attempts. We produced mortality modeling, giving estimates of how many fish would expect to perish due to different flow reductions and temperature-related effects. We've participated in the value planning study, and we've conducted habitat mapping for the whole river. Again, this is a short list. There's a lot more than that. Just quickly on habitat, we've completed 11 projects and counting at this point. I show their distribution in the slide on the right. They include both main stem projects as well as tributary projects, like the Creek project. And the projects are really working. This is the Nimbus Basin project, which we completed in 2014. We can see the before and after. This is actually where the new fish ladder will be coming around, skirting the edge of the project. And this image on the right is predicted habitat suitability, with the green being what we predict to be high quality spawning habitat. All these dots are reds that occurred 2 months after the project was constructed. So we built the project, we walked away. Within months, a quarter of all of the reds observed in the river occurred here at Nimbus Basin. That would be 926 reds, and they nearly all occurred in areas where we thought they should occur, which gives us a lot of confidence in our predictive modeling. With that, I'm done, and I'm happy to take any additional questions there may be.
Great, Chris, thank you. That was an incredibly impressive presentation. Thank you. I know I learned it. I mentioned that too for everybody. Thank you. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes. Love to open this up for some broader questions for Chris, for his insights on stuff he shared and sort of the Water Forum 2 path ahead or just observations folks have. So again, just either raise a hand, a virtual hand if you can, by going into the participants box, or just let me know in the chat that you want to ask a question. It's a little hard to see everybody, so if you just raise your hand on the screen, it'll be a little bit harder for me to see that. So, Greg, I see you have a question.
Chris, great job, very informative, and I learned a lot. I had a lot to learn. What sorts of things, I guess, that we're not doing, do you think that would be good for us to do, or it's just sort of more what we are doing?
think we should absolutely keep up with what we are doing and engage with reclamation every turn in the road. Basically, any chance they give us to help, we should get involved. And as I pointed out, we're pretty involved. They ask us questions and we're able to answer in the number of days and inform management. I think Waterforum continuing to push on the improvements of temperature management infrastructure is particularly important. It would be really nice if we could become involved with the development of the TCD design. I think that our knowledge goes a long way there, and we were able to bring a lot of important details to the Corps as they considered it. Thankfully, HDR is advancing that design, and HDR is a consultant for the Waterforum, so we're hopeful that we have sort of an internal route to provide some input there. There's absolutely something that needs to be done at Lake Natoma and Nimbus. It's for the most part been left off the table for a while, but it's not going to be an easy fix, but it's something that we absolutely must do if we want to continue to have these cold water species in our river. Obviously, the work on the flow management standard is beyond invaluable, and the fact that it's based off of science with regards to available habitat and temperature. As you learn from this presentation, the big gorilla in the room is hatchery management. There's a lot of people involved there. I'm not sure whether the Waterforum needs to get involved or not, but something absolutely needs to get done there. So I'll kind of leave that for folks to think about whether they want to engage and push on that. It's a really, really contentious topic, and it's really tricky from one perspective where they're producing fish for people to catch, and the other perspective trying to maintain what's left of our natural fishery, which, to be frank, on the American is pretty limited. You know, if we wanted to get back to a good wild fishery, we would want to reintroduce different genetics. And for example, the folks at Kramer Fish Sciences, under contract to the Bureau of Reclamation, actually surveyed the genetics of rainbow trout upstream of Folsom with the goal of identifying fish that had anadromous genetic expression, to utilize those to improve the genetic pool of American River steelhead. At this point, American River steelhead are all originated from Eel River steelhead that have then now kind of been interbreeded and genetically diluted into even less fit fish than that. So that's another area where I think there is certainly need. Lastly, we have to keep up the habitat work. It is beyond invaluable. As I didn't say it, but at this point we have about half of the fish that return are spawning in a project that the Waterforum built, and without that they would not be doing as successful as well. We've turned a corner, and we're starting to think a lot more about rearing habitat now, and I think that's sort of the next wave for us, where we've been incorporating it in the salmon and the spawning project. Now we are sort of endeavoring to create acres and acres of rearing habitat, whether it be side channel or seasonally inundated floodplain. But that seems to be the big gap where the Waterforum can continue to make a really big impact on improving the fishery. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
It looks like Clyde has a question. Clyde?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Clyde? Clyde, you may be on mute. So you either need to click the mute or do a *6 if you're on your phone.
Okay, there we go. You hear me now?
Perfectly.
Hey, Clyde.
Okay. Peter Moyle and Jacob Katz, who Peter Moyle is the kind of the big fishery guru at the University of California, Davis, and Jacob Katz is one of his PhD students, got his PhD. But they wrote I think it was a blog, and they suggested that the hatcheries be moved away from the top, right below the dams, move down, way down, they didn't say where, but move them downstream so that the hatchery fish would go into those facilities, leaving the rivers for the natural spawners. And any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a great idea. It may be challenging to implement, but most things are. I think they suggested that the hatcheries essentially be moved to the estuary, and so there's two really valuable aspects there. One, you leave the natural river environment for the natural spawners so that they aren't impacted both through genetic dilution of hatchery fish, and they're also not competing for resources. At this point we have natural juveniles swimming downstream, and then all of a sudden 500,000 hatchery fish are released, and there's absolutely competition for resources that occurs there. And so you both leave the natural environment for the hopefully more wild fish and the resources that are available there. You reduce competition, and you reduce the sort of genetic dilution or inbreeding that's occurring. And then on the hatchery side, you end up with better results because you significantly reduce mortality as the poorly acclimated or evolved hatchery fish run the gauntlet of the river and the delta. If we can sort of cut that out as much as possible, and we're doing that nowadays by trucking fish, but it's sort of unnecessary if we just put the fish farm closer to the ocean.
Chris, is that just a financial issue, or are there other sort of constraints there?
I can't totally speak to it. There's the hatchery folks, and I may get myself in hot water here. They like how they do it, and they don't think there's anything wrong with it. And they're in the business of growing fish, and they aren't particularly happy when outsiders tell them how they should do it. I think there is that sort of led to that hatchery review that I talked about. And so there's some level of political resistance, but it sure seems feasible to me. It doesn't seem undoable given the other things we're doing.
Thanks. Rob Burness, you want to jump in? You're on mute, Rob, so you need to take your stuff off.
Sorry.
There you go.
There's a lot to absorb, and I have to admit that I'm not sure I got all of it. But it struck me that the key factor in improving the rearing habitat quality is higher flows, and in some cases much higher flows. Has there been any serious look at the feasibility of improving rearing habitat given the flow needs?
I'll answer that by pivoting slightly. I think there are two ways to increase rearing habitat, and they are flow and non-flow actions. So as I showed, yes, more flow does provide more rearing habitat. However, it is relatively small incremental increases per CFS or even per 1,000 CFS. Now, in contrast, the non-flow actions would be topographic modification and revegetation. So creating areas that inundate and have the right characteristics, meaning depthosity, cover, and that we can do that with bulldozers and planting trees, and we can do that with the current flow regime. And so that I think is a far more probable way to try to get the amount of habitat we think we need. Now, to your question about the feasibility, as part of the flow management standard technical team, we've investigated dozens, if not hundreds, of potential iterations on how flow could be released. And what really happens is if we release more flow in the spring, there are two impacts. One, the water isn't available for water supply when we need it, and we release cold water that we desperately need to utilize during the warm summer months and the fall for either steelhead rearing or fall run Chinook spawning. And so we've looked at that over and over, and there's not really a way to do that, considering the artificial system that we're in. And I'm a big fan of natural flow. I mean, I'm a big fan of natural flow regimes, but in this altered environment, it doesn't necessarily work because we have to provide cold temperature in an area that wouldn't have been cold previously, because we're forcing these fish to complete their freshwater life cycles in the baking hot valley floor rather than going farther upstream.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to try to sneak in one last question here before we break. Roy, your hand is up.
Yes, Chris, I'm interested, as the water forum continues to enhance habitats in the Lower American, how much effort is going to be needed to maintain the habitats that are created, given the hydrology of the river, the dynamics of the river. Seems that could be a big part of the future effort, is just trying to keep what you have in operational condition. Thank you.
That's a great question. I'll separate it into spawning habitat and rearing habitat. Spawning habitat absolutely evolves. I won't say that it degrades, but the reality is no coarse sediment is passing by Folsom or Nimbus Dam, and the water, the hungry water, as it were, will absolutely transport the spawning material that we put in the river. And so we just expect that job will go on forever. And in fact, we've already now, just last year in 2019, we revisited our first site. So the Upper Sailor Bar project right across from the hatchery was initially built in 2008 and 2009. And then 10 years later, or more than 10 years later, we came back and we basically topped it off. We added a bunch of gravel and we added a side channel. And so on the spawning side, we will absolutely have to keep at it, and the habitat the habitat amount will reduce through time, if not. Now on the rearing side, it's a little different. Rearing habitat absolutely evolves, but it requires much less maintenance. And so if we perform excavation, we bring out the big orange metal, we reduce an area by say 10 feet, and we plant it such that it is more frequently inundated by our current flow regime, that habitat degrades in a much different way. And I would say that it doesn't necessarily degrade. It actually evolves and gets better. And so the plants will get larger, the characteristics of the habitat will improve through time. The one area where there may be a need for maintenance is in side channels and alcoves, where deposition of sediment at the mouth of them could disconnect them or make them less connected. And that may be an area where some sort of maintenance is required. I guess the other component of maintenance of rearing habitat, and it's something we learned at Cordova Creek, is that weeds really like to grow. We can do our best to plant the right species, but we have a wide variety of cosmopolitan weeds that really enjoy our habitat, and we really have to act to maintain them such that we end up with the type of habitat that we desire. So that's the main maintenance on rearing projects in my mind.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I know we have at least one other person in the queue, but we are out of time for this. Felix, I sent you a note. If you throw the question in the queue, we can try to get you an answer after the fact. So I would encourage you to do that. Chris, just thank you very much for a really phenomenal presentation. Super interesting, and you've clearly given the group a lot to be working with and thinking about as we go forward. I want to remind folks of